The blood soaking through her thin stockings had turned from bright red to a dark, sticky brown, and Violet Dawson could no longer feel the wooden floorboards beneath her feet as she spun and kicked to the raucous piano music echoing through the Red Garter Saloon. 3 days. She had been dancing without more than a few minutes of rest. 3 days since Frank Mathers had decided to make an example of her for daring to refuse his advances. And the spring of 1878 in Salina, Kansas had become her own personal hell. The other girls watched from the bar with hollow eyes, knowing that any one of them could be next if they stepped out of line, and the men who filled the saloon threw coins at her feet while laughing at her stumbling, delirious movements. Violet had arrived in Salina 6 months ago on a stagecoach from St. Louis, fleeing a father who drank away every cent the family had and a mother too worn down by life to protect her daughters anymore. She had been 19 years old then, full of hope that she could find honest work as a seamstress or a cook, maybe even a schoolteacher if she was lucky. Instead, she had found that respectable work for a young woman alone in a frontier town was scarce, and when her money ran out after 2 weeks, Frank Mathers had been there with his oily smile and false promises. He had told her she would just be serving drinks, that the Red Garter was a respectable establishment, that she would have her own room and 3 meals a day. By the time she realized the truth, she was already in debt to him for the room, the meals, and the gaudy dresses he forced the girls to wear. The piano player, an aging man named Chester who had lost 3 fingers in a mining accident, pounded out another wild tune, and Violet forced her legs to keep moving even though every step sent white-hot agony shooting up through her calves. Her dark hair, once pinned up in careful curls, now hung in sweaty tangles around her face, and the red satin dress she wore was soaked through with perspiration. Frank Mathers sat at his usual table in the corner, a fat cigar clenched between his teeth, watching her with cold satisfaction. He was a broad man with a thick neck and small, mean eyes, and he ruled the Red Garter and the girls who worked there with an iron fist and a quick temper. "Keep dancing, darling," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "You stop before I say so, and I will make you wish you had never been born." Violet tried to respond, but her throat was too dry, her voice nothing but a rasp. She had not had water in hours, and the room spun around her in a sickening blur of faces and smoke. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and she knew she was close to collapsing, but she also knew that if she fell, Frank would only find new ways to punish her. He had done it before to other girls, and the stories the women whispered late at night in their shared rooms were enough to keep Violet on her feet through sheer terror, alone. The front door of the saloon swung open, letting in a blast of cool evening air that felt like heaven against Violet's burning skin. Through her haze of exhaustion, she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the fading light outside. A man in worn denim and a dusty hat, with a rifle slung across his back and spurs that jangled with each step. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and when he pushed his hat back, Violet caught a glimpse of a weathered face with sharp features and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dylan Anderson had been riding for 3 weeks straight, driving a herd of cattle north from Texas to the railhead in Abilene, and he had stopped in Salina only to resupply before continuing on. He was 24 years old, the son of a rancher who had died when Dylan was 16, leaving him to run the family spread with nothing but grit and determination. The years had hardened him, turned him from a green boy into a man who could outride, outshoot, and outwork most anyone on the plains, but they had not taken away the sense of right and wrong his mother had instilled in him before fever claimed her life when he was 12. He stepped into the saloon, expecting the usual scene of card games and drinking, and the kind of rough entertainment that frontier towns offered. But what he saw instead made him stop dead in his tracks. A young woman was dancing in the center of the room, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. And even from across the smoky interior, he could see the dark stains on her stockings, and the way she swayed as if she might fall at any moment. Her face was pale as milk, except for two bright spots of fever on her cheeks, and her eyes had the glazed, distant look of someone pushed far beyond their limits. Dylan had seen a lot of hard things in his life, had witnessed the cruelty that men could inflict on each other and on the land itself. But something about the sight of this girl being forced to perform while clearly in agony struck him like a physical blow. He moved toward the bar, his eyes never leaving her, and when he spoke to the bartender, his voice was low and tight with controlled anger. "What the hell is going on here?" The bartender, a thin man with a nervous twitch, glanced toward the corner where Frank Mathers sat. "Boss is teaching one of the girls a lesson. Best not to interfere, friend. Frank does not take kindly to strangers poking their noses in his business." Dylan turned to look at Mathers, taking in the man's satisfied expression and the way he lounged in his chair like a king surveying his domain. Everything about the scene made Dylan's blood boil, made him think of the stories his mother used to tell him about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves, about how a real man protected the weak instead of preying on them. "How long has she been dancing?" Dylan asked, his hands curling into fists at his sides. 3 days, near as I can figure. Frank caught her trying to run off, and this is her punishment. She will dance until he says she can stop, or until she drops dead, whichever comes first. Dylan felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, a fury so pure and clean it almost frightened him. He had never been one to go looking for trouble, had always tried to live his life according to the principles his parents had taught him, but there were moments when a man had to take a stand, had to draw a line and say that enough was enough. This was one of those moments. He walked across the saloon floor, his boots echoing on the wood, and every conversation in the room slowly died away as men sensed that something was about to happen. Violet was still dancing, still forcing her tortured body to move, and when Dylan reached her, he gently caught her by the arm. She flinched at the touch, her eyes wild with fear and confusion, and up close he could see that her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. "It is all right," he said softly, his voice meant only for her. "I have got you now. Who the hell do you think you are?" Frank Mathers roared, shoving back from his table so hard that his chair crashed to the floor. "Get your hands off my property." Dylan turned to face him, keeping Violet steady with one arm. "She is not property. She is a human being, and what you are doing to her is wrong." Frank's face turned an ugly shade of purple, and he strode forward with his fists clenched. He was bigger than Dylan, outweighed him by at least 40 pounds, but Dylan had learned a long time ago that size was not everything in a fight. "This is my saloon, boy, and that girl works for me. She owes me money, and she will do whatever I tell her to do until that debt is paid. Now get out before I have my boys throw you out." As if on cue, 3 large men detached themselves from various positions around the room and began moving toward Dylan. They were the kind of hired muscle that places like the Red Garter always seemed to attract. Men with broken noses and scarred knuckles who did not ask questions as long as the money was good. Dylan carefully released Violet, making sure she could stand on her own, though she immediately began swaying dangerously. He positioned himself between her and the advancing men, his mind racing through his options. He was fast with a gun, faster than most, but starting a shootout in a crowded saloon would put innocent people at risk, including the very woman he was trying to protect. He would have to find another way. "I will buy her debt," he said, looking directly at Frank. "Whatever she owes you, I will pay it right now, and then she walks out of here with me." Frank laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Her debt is $500, boy. You have that kind of money on you." It was an outrageous sum, more than most working men saw in a year, but Dylan happened to have almost exactly that amount in his saddlebags from the sale of his cattle. He had been planning to use it to buy breeding stock and make some much-needed repairs to his ranch, but looking at Violet's ravaged face and bleeding feet, he knew there was no choice to make. "I have it," he said simply. Frank's eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with greed. "Show me." Dylan shook his head. "I will get it after she is sitting down and has had some water, and after you call off your dogs." For a long moment, Frank just stared at him, clearly trying to decide whether Dylan was bluffing. Then he waved a hand and the three men reluctantly backed off. "Chester, stop playing that damn piano. Somebody get the girl a chair and some water." One of the other saloon girls, a blonde woman with kind eyes, hurried forward with a chair and a pitcher of water. Dylan helped Violet into the seat, and she immediately grabbed the pitcher with shaking hands, drinking so desperately that water spilled down the front of her dress. When she finally lowered the pitcher, she looked up at Dylan with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made his chest ache. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He nodded, wanting to say something comforting, but knowing that they were not out of danger yet. He left her with the blonde woman and walked out to where he had tied his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Smoke. His saddlebags were heavy with the coins and bills that represented months of hard work, and as he pulled out the money, he felt a moment of doubt about what he was doing. He did not know this girl, had no reason to throw away his future for a stranger, but then he thought about his mother and the stories she used to tell, and he knew that some things were more important than money. He returned to the saloon and dropped the money on Frank's table with a heavy thud. $500. Count it if you want, but it is all there." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the money, and Dylan could see the wheels turning in the man's head, the calculations about whether he could take the money and still keep the girl. Dylan rested his hand on the butt of his revolver, not drawing it but making it clear that he was prepared to if necessary. "She is free and clear," Dylan said, his voice hard as iron. "Any debt she owed is paid in full. And if I ever hear that you have bothered her again, if I even hear a rumor that you have come near her, I will come back here and we will finish this conversation in a way you will not enjoy." Frank licked his lips, his eyes darting between Dylan's face and the gun at his hip. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. Take the worthless girl. She was more trouble than she was worth anyway." Dylan turned his back on Frank, a calculated insult, and walked over to where Violet sat. She was still drinking water, and some color had returned to her face, though she looked like she might pass out at any moment. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. She nodded, though when she tried to stand, her legs buckled and she would have fallen if Dylan had not caught her. Without hesitation, he swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, her head falling against his shoulder. "Wait," said the blonde woman who had brought the water. She darted toward the back of the saloon and returned a moment later with a small carpet bag. "Her things. It is not much, but it is all she has." Dylan nodded his thanks, and the woman tucked the bag under his arm. As he carried Violet toward the door, he could feel every eye in the saloon on them, could sense the tension in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. He half expected Frank to try something, to order his men to attack or to pull a gun himself. but the saloon owner just sat at his table counting his money with greedy fingers. They made it outside into the cool evening air, and Dylan heard Violet take a deep, shuddering breath, as if she had been holding it the entire time. He carried her down the street to the small boarding house where he had rented a room, ignoring the curious stares of the people they passed. The landlady, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Henderson, opened her mouth to protest when she saw Dylan carrying an unconscious woman into her establishment, but he cut her off. "This lady needs a room and a doctor. I will pay whatever it costs, Mrs." Henderson's expression softened slightly when she saw the state Violet was in. "Second door on the left upstairs. I will send my boy for Doc Morrison." Dylan carried Violet up the narrow stairs and into the small but clean room Mrs. Henderson had indicated. He laid her carefully on the bed, and only then did he get a good look at her feet. The sight made him suck in a sharp breath. Her stockings were stuck to her skin with dried blood, and he could see blisters and raw, torn flesh through the thin fabric. How she had managed to keep dancing with injuries like that, he could not begin to imagine. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had spent every cent he had to buy the freedom of a woman whose name he did not even know, had threatened a powerful man in his own establishment, and now he was responsible for seeing that she recovered. It was reckless and impulsive, completely unlike his usual careful, measured approach to life, but he could not bring himself to regret it. Violet's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the room in confusion before her gaze settled on Dylan. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "Safe," he said simply. "You are safe now. A doctor is coming to look at your feet." Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "You bought my freedom. You spent all that money on me. Why, you do not even know me." Dylan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her intently. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because no one deserves to be treated the way Frank Mathers was treating you. And because my mother raised me to believe that we are judged not by how we treat our equals, but by how we treat those who have no power to defend themselves." She reached out a trembling hand, and after a moment, he took it, her small fingers disappearing in his calloused palm. "My name is Violet Dawson," she said, "and I am forever in your debt." "Dylan Anderson," he replied, "and you are not in my debt. You do not owe me anything." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door and Doc Morrison entered. He was an older man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, and he took one look at Violet's feet and let out a low whistle. "Young lady, I do not know how you are still conscious. Those are some of the worst injuries I have seen in a while." Dylan stood up to give the doctor room to work, but Violet held onto his hand tightly, her eyes pleading with him not to leave. He settled back into his chair, and she relaxed slightly. Doc Morrison carefully cut away her stockings, revealing the full extent of the damage. Both feet were covered in blisters, some burst and weeping, others swollen and angry red. The skin on her heels and the balls of her feet was torn away entirely in places, exposing raw flesh beneath. "This is going to hurt," Doc Morrison said gently, pulling out bottles of antiseptic and clean bandages from his bag. "I have to clean these wounds thoroughly, or infection will set in." Violet nodded, biting her lip, and when the doctor poured the first splash of antiseptic over her feet, she squeezed Dylan's hand so hard he thought she might break his fingers. But she did not cry out, did not scream, just bit her lip until it bled and trembled with the effort of holding in her pain. Dylan found himself in awe of her strength, her courage in the face of such agony. It took Doc Morrison the better part of an hour to clean and bandage both feet, and by the time he was finished, Violet was pale and sweating, her eyes glassy with pain. The doctor left her some laudanum for the worst of it, and strict instructions to stay off her feet for at least 2 weeks while they healed. "She is a strong one," Doc Morrison said to Dylan as they stood in the hallway outside the room. "Another day or two of that torture, and she would have died from infection or exhaustion. You probably saved her life." After the doctor left, Dylan returned to the room to find Violet fighting to stay awake. "You should rest," he said softly. "I will be right here if you need anything." "Where will you sleep?" she asked, her words slurring slightly from the laudanum. "In my room next door. I will leave the doors open so I can hear you if you call." She nodded, her eyelids drooping. Just before she fell asleep, she whispered, "Thank you, Dylan Anderson. You are a good man." He sat with her until her breathing evened out and he was sure she was deeply asleep. Then he quietly moved to his own room. But sleep eluded him, and he found himself standing at the window, looking out over the dark streets of Salina and thinking about what came next. He had no money left, no way to buy the breeding stock he needed or make the repairs to his ranch. He would have to find work somewhere, somehow, to earn enough to get by. And he had a responsibility now to make sure that Violet was truly safe, that Frank Mathers did not try to come after her once Dylan left town. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he could not leave. Not yet. Not until he knew she was healed and had somewhere to go, someone to look after her. The problem was that he did not have the funds to stay in Salina indefinitely, paying for 2 rooms at the boarding house and food for both of them. He would need to find work, and fast. The next morning, Dylan woke early and checked on Violet. She was still sleeping, her face peaceful for the first time since he had seen her. He left a note saying he would be back soon and went downstairs to talk to Mrs. Henderson about finding work. The landlady proved to be a practical woman with connections throughout the town. And by noon, Dylan had hired on as a temporary hand at the livery stable, mucking out stalls and caring for horses in exchange for room and board for himself, and enough to cover Violet's room as well. It was hard, dirty work, but Dylan had never been afraid of hard work, and it felt good to have a purpose, to be building towards something even if that something was just getting through each day. He checked on Violet between shifts, bringing her food from the boarding house kitchen, and making sure she was taking her medicine. She slept most of the first 2 days, her body finally able to rest after the ordeal she had been through, but on the 3rd day, she was awake and alert when he came to visit. "You have been working," she said, noticing the hay stuck to his shirt and the smell of horses that clung to him. He nodded, settling into the chair beside her bed. "At the livery stable, it pays enough to keep us both fed and housed for now." Her eyes filled with tears again, and she looked away. "You have already given so much for me. You should not have to work like a common laborer because of me. You should take what money you can earn and go back to your ranch." "I am not leaving until I know you are all right," he said firmly. "And there is nothing wrong with honest labor. My father started out mucking stalls before he built up his ranch." She turned back to him, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "The truth. Most men would have paid my debt and expected something in return, but you have been nothing but respectful and kind. I do not understand." Dylan was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right words. "When I was 12 years old," he finally said, "my mother got sick with a fever. We lived pretty far from town, and my father had to leave me and my younger sister with her while he rode to fetch the doctor. I was supposed to take care of them both, but I was just a scared kid and I did not know what to do. My mother kept getting worse, and my sister kept crying, and I felt so helpless." He paused, the memories still painful even after all these years. A neighbor woman, someone we barely knew, happened to ride by checking on her own property. She saw that something was wrong and came inside. She stayed with us for 3 days straight, nursing my mother, caring for my sister, making sure I ate and slept. She did not ask for anything in return, did not expect payment or gratitude. She just saw people in need and helped them because it was the right thing to do. Violet listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. "My mother died anyway," Dylan continued, his voice rough. "But that neighbor woman had made her last days more comfortable, had made sure she was not alone and afraid. Before she left, she told me something I have never forgotten. She said that we are all just passing through this life, and the only thing that matters in the end is how we treat each other. She said that kindness is not something you give expecting something back. It is just something you do because you are human and so is the person who needs help." He looked directly at Violet, his gray eyes steady. "So that is why I am doing this. Not because I expect anything from you, not because I want you to feel indebted to me. Just because you needed help and I was able to give it." Violet reached out and took his hand, and this time there was no fear or desperation in the gesture, just a simple connection between two people who understood each other. "Your mother and that neighbor woman would be proud of the man you have become," she said softly. They sat like that for a while, neither speaking, just taking comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Violet said, "I should tell you about how I ended up at the Red Garter. You should know who you are helping." "You do not have to," Dylan started to say, but she shook her head. "I want to. I need to say it out loud, to someone who will not judge me." So she told him everything, about her father's drinking and her mother's despair, about fleeing St. Louis with nothing but a small bag of clothes and the hope of starting over. She told him about arriving in Salina full of optimism, about how quickly that optimism had died, when she realized how few options a woman alone had on the frontier. She told him about Frank Mathers and his false promises, about realizing too late that she had signed away her freedom for a meal and a roof over her head. "I tried to make the best of it at first," she said, her voice distant with memory. "I served drinks and tried to avoid the worst of the customers. Some of the other girls had been there for years, trapped by debts they could never repay because Frank kept adding charges for every little thing. Food, lodging, dresses, even the rouge and powder we were supposed to wear. I knew I was heading down the same path, but I did not know how to get off it." She explained how Frank had started paying her unwanted attention, how he had made it clear that he expected her to provide services beyond just serving drinks. When she had refused, he had flown into a rage and told her that if she was too good for his customers, then she could dance until she learned some humility. "I thought he meant for an evening," Violet said, her voice breaking. "Maybe a night. I did not realize he meant days. By the second day, I could not feel my feet anymore. By the third day, I was so delirious I thought I was going to die. And then you walked through that door." Dylan felt that cold fury settle in his chest again, the same rage he had felt when he first saw her dancing. "He will never hurt you again," he said, and it was a promise. "I will make sure of it." Over the next 2 weeks, as Violet's feet slowly healed, Dylan fell into a routine. He would work at the livery stable from dawn until early afternoon, then spend the rest of the day with Violet, talking and getting to know each other. She was smart and funny when she was not in pain, with a quick wit and a way of seeing through people's pretenses that Dylan found refreshing. She asked him about his ranch, about what it was like growing up on the plains, about his dreams for the future. He told her about the land his father had claimed, about the 160 acres of grassland that was perfect for raising cattle. He told her about the small ranch house that needed repairs, about the barn with the leaky roof, about the creek that ran through the property and never went dry even in the hottest summers. He told her about his dream of building something lasting, something he could pass down to his children someday. "It sounds beautiful," Violet said wistfully. "I have never had a real home, not one that was mine. We always lived in places that belonged to someone else, always 1 month away from being thrown out on the street." "You could have a home," Dylan said impulsively. "You could come to the ranch with me." The words hung in the air between them, and Dylan immediately felt his face heat up. "I mean, you could work there as a housekeeper or a cook. It would be respectable, and you would have a place to live where no one could hurt you or make demands of you." Violet looked at him for a long moment, and he could not read the expression in her dark eyes. "Is that really what you are offering?" she asked quietly. "A job as your housekeeper." Dylan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The truth was, over the past 2 weeks, his feelings for Violet had grown into something much more complicated than simple concern for someone in need. He found himself thinking about her when he was working, found himself hurrying through his chores so he could spend more time with her. He loved the sound of her laugh, the way she worried her bottom lip when she was thinking about something serious, the strength and resilience she had shown in the face of terrible circumstances. But he also knew that she was vulnerable right now, that she had been through a traumatic experience and was dependent on him for her safety and well-being. The last thing he wanted was to take advantage of that vulnerability, to make her feel like she owed him anything more than friendship. "I am offering you whatever you need," he finally said. "A job, a home, a fresh start. No strings attached. If you want to come to the ranch as my housekeeper, that is fine. If you want me to help you get set up somewhere else, in a different town where Frank Mathers cannot find you, I will do that too. I just want you to be safe and happy." She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "You are too good to be true, Dylan Anderson. I keep waiting for you to show your true colors, to demand payment for everything you have done for me. But you never do. You just keep being kind and decent and honorable." "That is not being too good to be true," he protested. "That is just being a decent human being." "Maybe," she said. "But decent human beings are rarer than you might think, especially out here. I would like to come to your ranch if the offer is genuine. I can cook and clean, and I am strong when I am not being tortured by sadistic saloon owners. I will earn my keep, I promise." "Then it is settled," Dylan said, feeling a surge of happiness that surprised him with its intensity. "As soon as Doc Morrison says you are well enough to travel, we will head out." That night, Dylan could not sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what he had committed himself to. He would be bringing a woman to his ranch, a woman he barely knew but who was already occupying more of his thoughts than was probably wise. He would be alone with her, miles from the nearest town, and he would have to be very careful to treat her with respect and propriety. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel trapped or obligated or afraid that he might turn out to be like Frank Mathers. But beneath the worry, there was also excitement. For the first time in years, since his father had died and left him alone on the ranch with nothing but hard work and loneliness for company, Dylan felt like he had something to look forward to. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his life was about to become more than just survival and endless toil. 3 days later, Doc Morrison pronounced Violet fit to travel as long as she took it easy and did not put too much strain on her feet. Dylan had used some of his earnings from the livery stable to buy supplies for the journey and a gentle mare for Violet to ride. He also bought her a proper traveling dress and boots, since her old clothes from the saloon were not suitable for life on a ranch. On the morning they were set to leave, Dylan went to settle accounts with Mrs. Henderson and found her in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. She looked up when he entered and wiped her hands on her apron. "I hear you two are heading out today," she said, her sharp eyes studying him. "You are taking that girl to your ranch." "I am," Dylan confirmed, waiting for the lecture he was sure was coming about impropriety and reputation. But Mrs. Henderson surprised him. "Good. That girl deserves a chance at a better life, and you seem like the kind of man who will give her that chance without demanding more than she is willing to give. You treat her right, you hear me?" "I will," Dylan promised. "I intend to, Mrs." Henderson reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Some food for the journey. And Dylan, if things work out the way I think they might, you bring her back here for a proper wedding. I would like to see how the story ends." Dylan felt his face grow hot. "We are not, she is just coming to work as my housekeeper." Mrs. Henderson snorted. "Sure she is. And I am the Queen of England, but you take your time, both of you. Some things cannot be rushed." Dylan found Violet waiting for him outside the boarding house, wearing her new dress and looking nervous but excited. Her feet were still bandaged, but she could walk without too much pain now, and there was color in her cheeks and a light in her eyes that had not been there before. "Ready?" he asked, and she nodded. They rode out of Salina heading west, and Dylan deliberately steered them past the Red Garter Saloon. It was mid-morning, and the saloon was quiet, but he could see movement inside through the dirty windows. He had not forgotten Frank Mathers, had not forgotten the way the man had treated Violet and the other women who worked for him. Part of him wanted to just ride on, to leave that part of Violet's life in the past where it belonged. But another part of him, the part that his mother had taught to stand up for what was right, could not let it go. "Wait here," he told Violet, dismounting from his horse. "Dylan, what are you doing?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. "Something I should have done 2 weeks ago," he said grimly. He walked into the saloon, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Frank Mathers was behind the bar, counting bottles, and he looked up when Dylan entered. His face darkened with anger. "You," Frank spat. "Come back to cause more trouble?" "No," Dylan said calmly. "I came to give you a warning. If you ever hurt another woman the way you hurt Violet, I will hear about it. And when I do, I will come back here and I will make sure you never hurt anyone again. Do you understand me?" Frank's hand moved toward something under the bar, probably a gun, but Dylan was faster. His revolver was out and pointing at Frank before the older man could even get his weapon clear. "Do not," Dylan said, his voice cold as winter. "You pull that gun and this ends badly for you." "I am not looking for a fight, Frank. I am just telling you how things are going to be. You are going to treat the women who work for you with respect and decency. You are going to pay them fair wages and let them leave when they want to leave, because if I hear otherwise, there will be consequences." "You cannot threaten me in my own place," Frank blustered, but there was fear in his eyes now. "I am not threatening you, I am promising you. There is a difference." Dylan holstered his gun and turned to leave, then paused. "Actually, on second thought, I am done with warnings." He walked behind the bar, ignoring Frank's protests, and began pulling bottles of whiskey and brandy from the shelves. He smashed them on the floor, one after another, until the whole place reeked of alcohol. Then he pulled out a match. "What are you doing?" Frank shouted, backing away. "You cannot burn down my saloon." "Watch me," Dylan said, and struck the match. He tossed it onto the alcohol-soaked floor, and flames sprang up immediately, spreading fast across the wood. Dylan walked out of the saloon without looking back, hearing Frank's screams behind him. Men were already rushing toward the building with buckets of water, but Dylan knew it was too late. The Red Garter was old and dry as tinder, and it would burn to the ground. He mounted his horse and looked at Violet, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "We should probably leave town now," he said. She laughed, a sound of pure disbelief and joy. You burned it down. You actually burned down the saloon. He had it coming, Dylan said simply. And maybe now the women who worked there will have a chance to find better lives. They rode hard for the first few hours, putting distance between themselves and Salina. And by the time they stopped to rest the horses, thick black smoke was rising in the distance behind them. Dylan felt no regret, only a sense of satisfaction that Frank Mathers had finally faced some consequences for his cruelty. The journey to Dylan's ranch took 4 days of steady riding. They traveled through the vast grasslands of Kansas, through country so open and empty it made Violet gasp with wonder. She had spent her whole life in cities and towns, surrounded by buildings and people, and the endless prairie was like nothing she had ever experienced. At night, they made camp under the stars, and Dylan showed her how to make coffee over an open fire and cook beans and bacon in a cast iron skillet. He was careful to set up their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. But as they talked late into the night about their pasts and their hopes for the future, that distance seemed to shrink. On the third night, a spring thunderstorm rolled across the plains, and they had to take shelter under a rocky overhang. The rain came down in sheets, turning the ground to mud and soaking through their clothes despite their shelter. Violet began to shiver, her teeth chattering, and without thinking, Dylan pulled her close to share his warmth. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him, and they sat like that for hours, listening to the rain and the thunder and not saying a word. When morning came and the storm had passed, they did not speak about what had happened, but something had shifted between them. The careful formality that Dylan had maintained was gone, replaced by something more natural and comfortable. They rode side by side instead of single file, and their conversations ranged from serious to playful, from sharing painful memories to laughing at silly stories from their childhoods. On the afternoon of the fourth day, they crested a rise and Dylan pointed ahead. "There it is. That is home." Violet shaded her eyes and looked where he was pointing. In the distance, she could see a small ranch house made of rough-hewn timber, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Beyond it, the prairie stretched away in all directions, and she could see the glint of water where Dylan had said his creek ran. It was isolated and remote, but there was something beautiful about it, something honest and real that appealed to her. As they rode closer, Violet could see that the ranch showed signs of neglect. The roof of the barn had holes in it, and some of the fence posts were leaning at crazy angles. The ranch house itself looked sturdy enough, but the front steps were broken and there were boards missing from the porch. It was clear that Dylan had been spreading himself thin, trying to keep everything running by himself. "It needs work," he admitted, sounding a bit defensive. "I have been so busy with the cattle and trying to keep the ranch going that I have not had time for repairs, but the bones are good. The house is solid and the land is prime grazing." "It is wonderful," Violet said and meant it. "It is a real home, or it will be once we fix it up." They spent the rest of the day settling in. The inside of the ranch house was sparse but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and 2 smaller bedrooms off to the side. Dylan insisted that Violet take the larger of the 2 bedrooms, the one that had belonged to his parents, while he took the smaller room that had been his as a child. Over the following weeks, they fell into a comfortable routine. Dylan worked on repairing the ranch and tending to his small herd of cattle, while Violet took over the cooking and cleaning and started a vegetable garden near the house. Her feet healed completely, leaving only faint scars as a reminder of what she had endured, and she grew stronger and healthier with each passing day. She proved to be an excellent cook, able to make filling, tasty meals out of the simple ingredients available to them. She also turned out to have a talent for managing the household accounts, and within a month, she had reorganized Dylan's chaotic record-keeping and found ways to save money on supplies. He was amazed and grateful, and told her so often, until she blushed and told him to stop making a fuss. But it was the small moments that Dylan treasured most. The way Violet hummed while she worked in the garden. The way she looked in the morning with her hair down around her shoulders and her face soft with sleep. The way she laughed at his terrible jokes and challenged him when she disagreed with something he said. He found himself falling for her slowly but surely, like a seed taking root and growing toward the sun. He was careful not to show it, not to make her uncomfortable. He remembered his promise to himself, that he would treat her with respect and give her space to heal from her ordeal. But it was getting harder to ignore his feelings, especially on the evenings when they sat together on the porch watching the sunset and their hands would accidentally brush, sending sparks of electricity through him. Violet was struggling with her own feelings. She had not expected to feel this way about Dylan, had not expected her gratitude and respect to transform into something deeper and more powerful. She found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the easy strength of his body and the determined set of his jaw when he was focused on a task. She loved his sense of humor, his fundamental decency, the way he treated her as an equal instead of as someone beneath him. But she was also afraid that her feelings were just a product of her dependence on him, of the fact that he had saved her and given her a home. Afraid that if she told him how she felt, it would ruin the comfortable friendship they had built. And afraid, most of all, that he did not feel the same way, that he really did see her as just his housekeeper and nothing more. The tension between them grew slowly over the summer months, manifesting in lingering glances and moments of charged silence. But neither of them said anything, both too afraid of ruining what they had. Everything changed on a hot August afternoon. Dylan had been working on repairing the barn roof, and Violet had brought him a jar of cool water from the well. As he reached down to take it from her, his hand slipped and he lost his balance, tumbling off the roof and landing hard on his back. The fall knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment he just lay there gasping, trying to remember how to breathe. Violet was beside him in an instant, her hands on his face, his chest, checking for broken bones. "Dylan, oh God, Dylan, are you all right? Can you hear me? Say something." He managed to drag in a breath, then another. "I am fine," he gasped. "Just had the wind knocked out of me." But Violet was crying, tears streaming down her face. "You scared me so badly. I thought you were dead. I thought you had broken your neck." He sat up carefully, testing his limbs. Everything seemed to be working, though he was going to have some spectacular bruises. "Hey, it is all right. I am fine, I promise. It would take more than a fall off a barn to kill me." She threw her arms around him, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe again. "Do not do that to me," she said fiercely. "Do not ever scare me like that again." He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the trembling in her body, and something inside him broke open. "Violet," he said softly, pulling back just enough to see her face. "Why are you so upset? I am fine." She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying, and he could see the truth written plainly on her face. "Because I love you, you idiot," she said, her voice breaking. "I have loved you for months now, and I cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you." Dylan felt like the world had just shifted beneath him. "You love me," he repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes," she said, looking away. "I know I should not. I know I am just your housekeeper and you were only being kind by bringing me here. But I cannot help how I feel, and I have been going crazy trying to hide it." He cupped her face in his hands, gently turning her back to look at him. "Violet Dawson, You are not just my housekeeper. You have never been just my housekeeper. You are the woman I think about every moment of every day. You are the reason I whistle while I work, and the reason I hurry through my chores. You are the first thing I want to see in the morning and the last thing I want to see at night. I have been in love with you since probably the second week I knew you, but I did not say anything because I did not want to pressure you or make you feel obligated. Her eyes widened. You love me, truly, truly, he confirmed, with everything I am. She kissed him then, or maybe he kissed her. Later, neither of them would be able to say who moved first. All Dylan knew was that her lips were soft and tasted like sunshine and hope, and that kissing her was the most natural thing in the world. He poured everything he felt into that kiss, all the longing and desire and love he had been holding back for months, and she responded with equal passion, her fingers tangling in his hair and pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dylan rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Marry me, Violet. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much I love you." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in the nearest town, a place called Wilson that was a half-day's ride from the ranch. Mrs. Henderson had somehow heard about the wedding and made the journey from Salina with a beautiful white dress for Violet and a stern lecture for Dylan about treating his wife right. Doc Morrison came too, pleased to see his patient not only recovered but glowing with happiness. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Dylan wore his best suit, the one he had not worn since his father's funeral, and Violet looked like an angel in the white dress Mrs. Henderson had brought. When the preacher asked Dylan to recite his vows, he looked into Violet's eyes and spoke from the heart. "I promise to love you and honor you for all my days. I promise to protect you and provide for you, to be faithful and true. I promise to make you laugh when you are sad and to hold you when you are scared. I promise to build a life with you that is full of joy and purpose and love. This I swear before God and everyone here." Violet's vows were just as heartfelt. "I promise to stand beside you through good times and bad. I promise to be your partner and your friend, your confidant and your love. I promise to make our house a home and to fill it with warmth and laughter. I promise to believe in you when you doubt yourself and to challenge you when you need it. I promise to love you with everything I am, every day for the rest of my life." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dylan kissed her with such tender passion that several of the women in attendance sighed. They spent their wedding night at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, in the same room where Violet had recovered from her ordeal, but now everything was different. Now she was Dylan's wife, and he was her husband, and they could finally express the love they felt without fear or restraint. Dylan was gentle with her, mindful that her experiences with men had not been good ones, but Violet was not afraid. She trusted him completely, knew down to her bones that he would never hurt her, would always put her needs and feelings first. Their wedding night was everything it should be, tender and passionate and full of joy, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both of them felt like they had come home at last. They returned to the ranch the next day, and life took on a new rhythm. They worked together during the day, repairing the ranch and tending to the cattle and the garden, and at night they lay in each other's arms and talked about their dreams for the future. Dylan wanted to expand the herd and maybe buy some horses to breed and sell. Violet wanted to start a real vegetable farm, growing enough to sell at market and bring in extra income. They both wanted children, a whole houseful of them to fill the ranch with noise and laughter. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Money was tight, and they had to work hard for every dollar. There were droughts that made the grass sparse and forced Dylan to drive his cattle further afield to find grazing. There were harsh winter storms that killed several head of cattle and damaged the barn that Dylan had just finished repairing. But they faced every challenge together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the small victories. Violet turned out to be as tough and resilient as any frontier woman, never complaining about the hard work or the isolation. She learned to shoot a rifle and helped Dylan defend the herd from wolves and coyotes. She learned to deliver calves when the cows had trouble birthing and to doctor sick animals with remedies passed down from Mrs. Henderson. She was Dylan's true partner in every sense of the word, and he fell more in love with her every day. In the spring of 1880, 2 years after they had met, Violet discovered she was pregnant. Dylan was overjoyed, building a cradle with his own hands and hovering over Violet like a nervous mother hen until she laughingly told him to stop fussing. She was healthy and strong, and the pregnancy progressed normally, though she did get tired more easily as the months went on. Their son was born on a cold November night, delivered by Mrs. Henderson, who had come to stay at the ranch for the last month of Violet's pregnancy. It was a long, difficult labor, and there were moments when Dylan was terrified that he might lose them both. But Violet was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined, and when dawn broke, their son was born, red-faced and squalling and absolutely perfect. They named him Jacob, after Dylan's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Dylan held him for the first time and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. This tiny, helpless creature was his son, a piece of himself and Violet combined into something entirely new and miraculous. Violet recovered quickly from the birth, and soon she was back to running the household with baby Jacob strapped to her back in a sling she had fashioned from soft cloth. Dylan marveled at her ability to do everything she had done before while also caring for an infant, and he did his best to help, taking Jacob in the evenings so Violet could rest. They discovered that being parents changed everything and nothing. The work was still hard, the money still tight, but now there was a new purpose to everything they did. They were not just building a ranch anymore, they were building a legacy for their son, creating a place where he could grow up safe and loved and strong. When Jacob was 2 years old, Violet became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to twin girls. They named them Sarah and Elizabeth, and Dylan joked that they were outnumbered now. The ranch house that had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them was now bursting at the seams with children and noise and chaos, and Dylan could not imagine being happier. The years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. The ranch prospered slowly but surely, growing from a struggling operation to a modest success. Dylan bought more land and more cattle, and Violet's vegetable farm became known throughout the county for producing the best produce around. They hired a few hands to help with the work, young men looking to learn the ranching trade, and the ranch became a place where people knew they would be treated fairly and paid honestly. Jacob grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the cattle and following his father around the ranch. Sarah and Elizabeth were inseparable, partners in mischief who kept Violet on her toes. They had Dylan's talent for getting into trouble and Violet's cleverness at getting out of it, and together they were a formidable force. In 1885, when Jacob was 5 and the twins were 3, Violet gave birth to another son. They named him Daniel, and he had red hair like Violet's grandmother and a sunny disposition that made everyone smile. With 4 children, the ranch house was definitely too small, so Dylan spent a year building an addition, expanding the house to include more bedrooms and a proper dining room. Through it all, Dylan and Violet's love for each other only grew deeper. They still had disagreements, still had moments of frustration and exhaustion, but they faced everything together. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, just as they had done when they were first falling in love, and Dylan would take Violet's hand and thank God for the day he had walked into the Red Garter Saloon. The town of Salina grew and changed over the years. The Red Garter Saloon was never rebuilt, and the lot where it had stood remained empty, a testament to Dylan's act of righteous fury. Frank Mathers had left town shortly after the fire, and no one seemed to miss him. Some of the women who had worked at the saloon found legitimate work in town, and a few even got married and started families of their own. Dylan and Violet became respected members of the community, known for their fairness and generosity. When drought struck and several of their neighbors lost cattle, Dylan shared his pasture and helped them rebuild their herds. When a family's house burned down, Violet organized the women of the county to bring food and clothing and help them get back on their feet. They gave back to the community that had welcomed them, and in return, they were loved and respected. In 1890, on a warm spring evening, Dylan and Violet celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary. The children were old enough now to mostly take care of themselves, and Dylan had surprised Violet by arranging for Mrs. Henderson to come stay at the ranch for a few days so they could have some time alone together. They rode out to a spot Dylan had found years ago, a place where the creek widened into a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. They had a picnic dinner and watched the stars come out, and Dylan looked at his wife, who was now 31 years old and more beautiful to him than ever. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me, living out here in the middle of nowhere with 4 wild children and a husband who still does not know how to fix a roof without falling off," Violet laughed, the same warm, musical laugh that had captured his heart so many years ago. "Not for a single second. This life, this family, this ranch, it is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dared to dream. You saved me, Dylan, in every way a person can be saved. You gave me love and freedom and a purpose. You gave me a home. You saved me too," he said seriously. "I was just existing before I met you, just going through the motions. You made me come alive again. You made me believe that life could be good, that love could be real. Everything good in my life started the day I carried you out of that saloon." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and he pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. They stayed there by the creek until the moon rose high above the prairie, talking and laughing and loving each other the way they had for 12 years and would for all the years to come. When Jacob turned 18 in 1893, he told his parents that he wanted to stay on the ranch and learn everything he could about running it. Dylan was proud beyond words, proud that his son wanted to carry on the legacy he and Violet had built. Sarah and Elizabeth, now 16, were courting a pair of brothers from a neighboring ranch, and Dylan suspected there would be a double wedding before too long. Daniel, at 10 years old, had announced that he wanted to be a doctor, inspired by stories about Doc Morrison that Violet had told him. Dylan and Violet were in their mid-30s now, the gray beginning to show in their hair, but they were healthy and strong and more in love than ever. The ranch was prosperous, the children were thriving, and life was good. Sometimes on quiet nights, Dylan would think back to that day in 1878 when he had walked into the Red Garter Saloon and seen a young woman dancing with blood-soaked feet. He would think about how close Violet had come to dying, how easily their paths might never have crossed. And then he would look at the life they had built together, at their children and their home and the love that filled every corner of their existence, and he would thank whatever force in the universe had put them in the same place at the same time. Because meeting Violet, saving her, loving her, had not just changed her life. It had changed his life too, had turned him from a lonely rancher into a husband and father and partner in the truest sense of the word. In 1898, 20 years after they had met, Dylan and Violet stood on their porch and watched as Sarah and Elizabeth celebrated their double wedding with a big party on the ranch grounds. Jacob was working beside his father full-time now, a capable young man of 23 who had his father's steady nature and his mother's quick mind. Daniel was away at school studying medicine, determined to bring modern health care to the frontier. The ranch had grown to over 300 acres, and the Anderson name was known and respected throughout Kansas. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the children were settled, Dylan and Violet lay in bed and talked about everything they had accomplished. They talked about the early days when they had nothing but each other and hope. They talked about the hard times they had weathered and the joys they had celebrated. They talked about their children and grandchildren to come, about the legacy they were building. "I would do it all again," Violet said, her head resting on Dylan's shoulder. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear. I would do it all again just to end up here with you." "I burned down a saloon for you," Dylan said with a slight smile. "I spent every cent I had. I gave up my plans and my future, and it was the best decision I ever made." She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining with tears and love. "You saved me." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "We built this life together every step of the way." She kissed him then, and in that kiss was 20 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. They had started as a desperate woman and a righteous cowboy, brought together by violence and need. But they had become so much more, two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to roll by, bringing new challenges and new blessings. Dylan and Violet watched their children grow and start families of their own. They welcomed grandchildren with the same joy they had welcomed their own children, spoiling them shamelessly and passing on the stories of how they had met and fallen in love. Jacob took over more and more of the ranch operations as Dylan slowed down, though Dylan never truly retired. He was too much a rancher at heart to ever stop working entirely. Violet continued to manage the household and the vegetable farm, though she now had help from her daughters and daughters-in-law. The ranch house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and Sunday dinners became a tradition where everyone gathered to eat and laugh and share stories. In 1903, 25 years after Dylan had carried Violet out of the Red Garter Saloon, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary with a huge party that brought together friends and family from across the state. Dylan was 49 years old now, his hair more silver than brown, but he was still strong and vital. Violet was 44, her beauty now mature and seasoned, her dark eyes still full of the same spark that had captured Dylan's heart so many years ago. At the party, their children surprised them by presenting them with a portrait a traveling artist had painted based on descriptions from Mrs. Henderson and others who had known them in the early days. It showed Dylan carrying Violet out of a burning building, his face determined and protective, her face exhausted but hopeful. It was not entirely accurate to the actual events, but it captured the essence of their story, the moment when their lives had changed forever. "This is our beginning," Dylan said, looking at the portrait with emotion thick in his voice. "This is where everything started." "No," Violet corrected gently, taking his hand. "Our beginning was before that. It was in every choice and every moment that led us both to that saloon on that day. It was in the kindness your mother taught you and the strength my struggles gave me." That moment in the saloon was not our beginning. It was just the first time our paths crossed. Our real beginning was when we chose to build a life together, when we chose love over fear and hope over despair. Dylan pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You always were the smart one in this marriage, and you were always the brave one," she replied. "Though I have to say, burning down the saloon was a bit dramatic," he laughed. "I have no regrets about that. Frank Mathers deserved it, and besides, it made for a good story." As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, Dylan and Violet stood together on the porch of the house they had built, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created. Their children and grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. The land stretched out around them, green and prosperous, a testament to years of hard work and careful stewardship. "We did good, did we not?" Dylan asked, his arm around Violet's waist. "We did better than good," she replied. "We did extraordinary. We took broken pieces and built something whole. We took pain and created joy. We took a chance encounter and made it a lifetime of love." They stood there until the stars came out, just as they had done 1,000 times before and would do 1,000 times more. They had traveled a long road together, from the hell of the Red Garter Saloon to the heaven of their ranch and family. They had faced every challenge hand in hand, had celebrated every victory side by side. They had loved each other through good times and bad, through plenty and want, through sickness and health. And when their time finally came, many years later, they went together, neither willing to leave the other behind. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood at their graves and told stories about the cowboy who had burned down a saloon and the woman he had carried out of it, about how they had built an empire of love and family out of nothing but courage and hope. The Anderson Ranch continued for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding to the legacy that Dylan and Violet had started. The story of how it all began became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories start in the darkest places, and that one act of courage can change not just two lives, but the lives of everyone who comes after. The portrait of Dylan carrying Violet out of the burning saloon hung in the ranch house for over 100 years, a symbol of the power of love and righteousness, of standing up for what is right no matter the cost. And every person who looked at it understood the truth at the heart of the image. That love is not just about grand gestures and passionate declarations, but about choosing to see another person suffering and deciding to do something about it, about building a life together one day at a time with patience and commitment and unwavering faith in each other. Dylan and Violet's story was not a fairy tale, not a perfect romance without conflict or struggle. It was real and raw and beautiful precisely because of its imperfections, because it showed that love is not something that just happens, but something that is built and maintained and fought for every single day. They had started as strangers, brought together by violence and desperation, but they had chosen to become partners, lovers, friends, and family. They had chosen each other over and over again, in 1,000 small moments and a handful of defining ones, and that choice had made all the difference. In the end, that was the true legacy of Dylan Anderson and Violet Dawson, not the ranch they built or the children they raised, but the example they set of what love could be when two people committed themselves fully to each other's happiness and well-being. They showed that it was possible to rise above the circumstances of your birth, to overcome trauma and hardship, to create beauty out of ashes. They showed that one person standing up for what is right could change the world, or at least change one person's world, and that sometimes that was enough. The Wild West was a harsh and unforgiving place, full of danger and difficulty. But it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, could leave behind the mistakes and tragedies of their past, and build new lives on the open prairie. Dylan and Violet had done exactly that, had taken the broken pieces of their individual lives and forged them into something strong and lasting and true. Their love had been tested by fire, literally and figuratively, and it had emerged purified and unbreakable. And so their story ended not with drama or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well cherished, and a legacy that would endure for generations. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had created light that still shone long after they were gone. They had proved that it was possible to be both tough and tender, both strong and gentle, both passionate and patient. They had shown what it meant to truly love someone, not just with words or gestures, but with every action and every choice, every single day. The Red Garter Saloon was long gone, burned to ashes by a righteous cowboy who refused to stand by and watch injustice. But the love that had been born from those ashes lived on, growing and spreading and touching countless lives. And that, in the end, was the greatest testament to Dylan and Violet's story. That love, real love, the kind that is built on respect and equality and genuine care for another person's well-being, never truly dies. It lives on in the children it produces, in the example it sets, in the way it changes the world one small corner at a time. Dylan Anderson had walked into a saloon one evening in the spring of 1878 and had made a choice that defined the rest of his life. Violet Dawson had endured unimaginable suffering and had survived to find joy and love beyond her wildest dreams. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both, a love story for the ages, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply choose to care about another person's pain and do something about it. Their story was the story of the Wild West itself, of hardship and triumph, of struggle and success, of people from different backgrounds coming together to build something new. It was a story about second chances and fresh starts, about the possibility of redemption and transformation. It was a story about the power of one good person to change another person's life, and about how that change can ripple outward to affect generations. And it all started with a dance, a cowboy, and a burning saloon.